This is In Your Opinion, and I'm Lin Su-Ling, opinion editor at the Straits Times. Today in the studio, we have Professor S Jayakumar, a giant of Singapore politics, a diplomat, and a legal scholar. And though he's retired from government since 2011 after serving as Senior Minister, Deputy Prime Minister, Coordinating Minister for National Security, and helming portfolios in foreign affairs, home affairs, law, and labour over the 30 years of his public life, he remains a respected figure in Singapore and in the ruling People's Actions Party. But there's another side to Professor S Jayakumar. As he's known to those around him, he's also a prolific author of 4 books on diplomacy, governance, and his memoirs. Now he's written a 5th, 3 unique laws published by the Straits Times Press. It's a historic recounting of some robust debates within Cabinet and the creation of 3 controversial institutions that have nonetheless become indelible parts of our political landscape. It's a salad bowl of acronyms that many Singaporeans might be familiar with: the Elected Presidency, or EP, the Non-Constituency Member of Parliament scheme, or NCMP, and the Group Representation Constituency, or the GRC. How does Prof. Jaya, a key architect of these institutions, view them 30 years on? Having been a key member of founding Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew's cabinet, does he think that Mr. LKY perhaps was more open to persuasion than Singaporeans realise? And what enabled that hallowed generation of leaders to be able to succeed and secure the best outcome for Singapore? Professor Jaya, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
I'll just get right into it. The GRC system. It was conceived to ensure Malay Muslim minority representation in Parliament. But in recent years, we've seen a series of unplanned exits with resignations by members of Parliament, including S Iswaran at West Coast GRC, Raisa Khan at Sengkang GRC, and most recently, Faisal Ibrahim in Marine Parade. My question to you is, do you consider these setbacks for the GRC system? And are they signs that perhaps the GRC system is overdue for refresh?
First of all, thank you for having me on your program. Let me pick up one point in what you said just now. The vacation of seats by some MPs. And whether that somehow casts doubt over the rationale of the GRC. I would like to frame the question differently. That is, to recall what was the purpose of the GRC, what was the intent of the GRC. I'm afraid some people have misconceptions about the GRC. You referred to 1, 2, or more minority MPs resigning for various reasons. The question is, does that somehow detract or disprove the validity of the GRC? So we go back to the basic question. What was the intent of the GRC? The GRC was intended to provide for a racially representative parliament. In other words, after the general elections, to ensure that there will be elected members who are racially representative of Singapore. Or put it another way, it was to prevent an undesirable situation where on election results night, the results are announced, and you find that there's no single Malay MP, no single Indian MP, or no single Eurasian MP, and all the MPs who are elected are from the majority race. So the question is not so much about the GRC as the objective, the concern, or the problem that we intended to tackle. The modality of tackling the problem is one issue. And as you read my book, we discuss different modalities. How to ensure that that undesirable situation does not take place? Do we agree as Singaporeans that it'll be bad to have an election result where there is no minority MP elected, or maybe just one or two. If the view is, that's okay, that's the luck of the draw, people have decided, so be it, in 4 years we don't have a minority MP, then you don't need any mechanism, whether the GRC or other measures which I had suggested to Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. But if, and I think most Singaporeans will agree, that that's an undesirable scenario, and we ought to have some mechanism to ensure that there will be racially representative parliament, then what ought that mechanism be can be discussed. The GRC is one mechanism that was decided by the cabinet then. I'll be dishonest to say that is the only possible mechanism, right? So the GRC provides that there will be X percentage of the elected members elected through GRCs. Some GRCs, one minority member must be a Malay, in some GRCs, Indian or other minority. So that's a mechanism. So you mentioned that some MPs have resigned. Look, in all parliaments in the world, there are members who step down for a variety of reasons. So it's not unusual in Singapore. The question is, has that made Parliament racially unrepresentative? Right? That's for the government to decide.
But
so,
those
yes.
GRCs, Sengkang, West Coast, and Marine Parade, they're left now without the minority representative.
Right. So that question leads me to clear one misconception. As I said just now, the intent of the GRC is for the entire slate of elected members to be racially representative. What is not the intention is that where there's a minority member of the team, that minority representative is to look after the interests of that minority. In other words, it's a misconception that a member of the GRC who's a Malay has to look after the Malays in that constituency, and the Chinese look after the Chinese in the constituency. That was never the intent. The intent was the GRC is a modality and a mechanism to provide for a racially representative. It was not intended that in that constituency, if a Malay representative loses his seat, that there must immediately be a by-election, because the other team members, all the team members in the GRC, are expected to look after all the residents. Take myself, for example. I was anchor minister for East Coast GRC for many years. I and my fellow GRC MPs, which included the then Speaker of Parliament, Abdullah Tarmugi, we looked after everyone, right? That's a misconception. Next, let me touch about the law, right? When in a single constituency, a member resigns or vacates his seat, there can be a by-election.
Like Michael Palmer. Michael Palmer.
Yes. The law provides there can be a by-election. There's some misconception that because of the misconception I mentioned just now, that where a minority MP or a non-minority MP resigns from a GRC, that there must be a by-election. There's no legal requirement in a GRC. In fact, the law expressly prohibits a by-election. The government has no power to call for a by-election where one member of the team steps down. The by-election can be called only if all the members of the team step down. So I thought it'd be useful to clarify that.
Well, another question then I have then is whether we have been placing too much weight and burden on the GRC system to tackle these issues of minority representation and race and religion. So, for example, at the general election in 2025, we saw in Tampines some issues rearing its ugly head. And I wonder whether what you make of that incident where identity politics was played and the race was quite close.
I come back to my starting point to remind ourselves what was the purpose of the GRC. The purpose of the GRC was not intended to diffuse or tackle identity politics or racial tensions. There are other instruments, modalities, and laws. Presidential Council for Religious Harmony, the recently enacted Racial Harmony Act, the many non-governmental bodies, inter-religious organization, the community-based organizations to ensure that problems like that are nipped in the bud. Of course, when a racial issue is egregious and becomes a security issue, then the Ministry of Home Affairs has its range of measures, including restriction orders under the Internal Security Act. But the GRC concept had a specific purpose, and that specific purpose was to provide in the Constitution a modality and an instrument to ensure that the slate of elected MPs will be racially representative. That was a purpose. Of course, I would add that although it's not a legislative provided purpose, the fact that you have Chinese and a minority come together as a team, we believed or hoped that it will provide an inbuilt check and a brake, that the majority MPs will be mindful of the statements they make about minorities, and the minority MP would be mindful of what he would say.
Did that happen in Tampines in 2025?
So the minority MP would tell his colleague, hey, look, that's beyond the pale. We may lose Malay votes. The majority MPs may counsel the minority MP, say, look, maybe you should not make this speech. It will upset the Chinese crowd. So that is a hope. But the main purpose is, as I said, to provide for a racially balanced, a racially representative parliament. And I don't think we should envisage that GRC to be able to solve racial tensions. That's an entirely different matter.
Let's move on to the elected presidency.
Yes.
Its main intent, of course, is to prevent a rogue government coming into power after what is called freak election results from raiding the reserves. And since the elected presidency came into force, we've had many general elections, we've had a handful of presidential elections, and the president has not had to exercise his constitutional blocking powers. Do you think you have more confidence in voters today?
Here again, I would like to start off with basics. That's my training. Whether we should talk more about the modality or the issue. The elected presidency was, just like the GRC, a modality to address a particular problem. What is that problem? The problem was, or the concern was, here you have X billions of dollars in the reserves. Now, of course, it's grown to huge sums. So the issue is whether the PAP government or an opposition government, ought a government tap the reserves, put a finger into the reserves for reasons or for causes which are not reasonable, or not justified, or not warranted. Because the concept is these reserves must be carefully nurtured and spent only in exceptional circumstances, as we have seen, for Singapore to weather the storms in two financial crises, in COVID, and God knows what future crisis may come, say, due to climate change and so on. So, I would like to frame the issue not insofar as the efficacy of the model, the modality, but do we agree that there is a concern and no government ought to easily, wantonly tap into the reserves and reduce the reserves, which may affect the ability of future generations to weather the storms? If we agree, then we can think of whether the elected president is the best model or some other mechanism. In fact, if you read the book, you'll find that the elected presidency was a suggestion by Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, but the younger ministers also put up other ideas, like Dr. Tony Tan put up a proposal how we can use the central bank as a check and balance. So there are more than one idea discussed. But here again, I think for clarity, it will be helpful to focus on that is the issue. Do we agree that's the issue? And do we agree that there should be some sort of check? If not the elected president, then what?
I hear you say it's important to have the guardrails in spite of the outcome. If I can just continue, one of the things discussed actively in the book is whether the president should be a separate center of power. In past, presidential candidates have claimed that their personal popularity, and if they win the mandate, they would have leeway to step beyond the constitutional blocking powers to even disagree with the Prime Minister on matters of policy. You yourself had weighed in 2023 to clarify matters. But of course, in 2023, we also saw a resounding victory for Taman Shanmugaratnam. And there's also been a lot of public airing on this matter in the past few decades. Do you think that the public has sufficient and better understanding of the powers of the presidency, including the limits?
Probably there can be better understanding, right, of and better explanation and education of the role of the presidency. Right? What we do not want, what I hope we do not have, is candidates for the presidential elections professing or confusing the voters that if elected, they will do certain things or they'll try to do certain things which the Constitution doesn't allow them to do. The Constitution gives the president certain powers which are described as custodial powers or blocking powers in a few areas: the spending of reserves, the appointment of key personnel, and two other narrowly circumscribed provisions concerning the detention without trial and investigations, CPIB. But the main focus of the custodial powers is on spending of reserves. He can block. If he's not satisfied, it's a justified tapping on the reserve. And on appointment of key personnel, right? It was unfortunate, as you mentioned, that one election, some of the candidates purported to be able to exercise powers and make proposals and policy issues. So yes, I did make a public statement which was carried that the president is not a center of power unto himself. Right? He has custodial powers, but for all other aspects, he acts on advice of the government. For all other aspects other than these narrowly subscribed matters, the government governs. Right?
Take it all together, though. Are you saying you're worried about the possibility of a rogue president coming into power and circumventing the PM in the cabinet?
I'm not saying that the rogue president, But I think it's important in the run-up to the election, there be clarity in the minds of the voters. What are they electing? Who are they electing? And the person they're electing as elected president would have powers to do what? Perhaps there's not sufficient understanding of that. So we don't want a situation where people vote for the presidency without a sufficient understanding of or sufficient clarity of what the roles of the president. If it takes time, it may take time for each new entrance into the electoral system to understand that. But it's my wish and hope that over time, people will understand that the government has this role, and for 90% of governmental tasks, the government is free to decide. But for certain X percent, 10%, they need the concurrence of the president. And therefore, the president is there for special check on the elected government.
I'd like to turn to the NCMP scheme, if you don't mind. In your book, it says, and I'll read a quote out, this observation that the existing parliamentary system has worked thus far because the existing theme of leaders had fought with adversaries in two severe crises and established their credentials. They are not beatable. But the new generation of voters...
That's a quote from Mr. Lee Kuan Yew.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. And when the new generation of voters become the majority, it's not certain that the PAP will be unbeatable. We may still be able to win, but support will be fragmented. And that was a quote in the discussions behind the NCMP scheme. How much of the motivations behind the NCMP were to secure the future of the PAP? Could you clarify for us? I ask also because readers might say that it lends weight to the argument that the NCMP scheme is a poison chalice.
Well, I'm not sure what is meant by poison chalice, but Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, when he proposed this, in my view, right, my view after discussing with him, he was very good in understanding the pulse of the country and reading the mood and expectations of the people. And after Anson, he told us it is very clear that
this was the Anson by-election in 1981.
He was convinced that it showed that the electorate wanted the PAP government to run the country, but they also wanted a check on the government with opposition MPs. He also wanted an opposition. And at that time, as you're aware, the PAP was very dominant, right? 100% of the seats. We lost one. So he said, if that is a mood, why don't we work into the Constitution a guarantee that even if his party, our party, or future party were to win all the seats, there will always be a guaranteed number of opposition MPs, right? So then he put me on the task of drafting the legislation, and it was very daunting because I couldn't find precedents anywhere in the world except Mauritius, which had a special provision for particular communities. So his idea was, if this is a mood, let's accept that as a fact. Right in the Constitution, there will be X number of opposition MPs at any time. The scheme that was eventually adopted, the present scheme, the NCMP, is again a modality for that objective. And you read the book, you'll find that the ministers discuss at least 3 different models, right? Alternative 1, Alternative 2, Alternative 3, including a proposal for a second election or second ballot.
For the NCMP.
NCMP.
Yes.
So that's a question of detail. So we worked out this, we decided on this model, which is that the best of the losing candidates will occupy the number of NCMPs. In other words, the Constitution provides that if there are less than X number of opposition MPs, right, then you'll fill the shortfall by getting the defeated candidates to join. So, as you know, initially, the opposition parties declined, but subsequently, till now, all the opposition parties have actually accepted the invitation. And in fact, for the opposition, it has worked quite well because some of the defeated candidates were able to perform in Parliament, make speeches and impress. And in fact, in the next round, they got elected, right? So you can say that perhaps that works. But the important point is that the Constitution now ensures that any time there will always be X number of opposition MPs. Perhaps in the process of elections, there will be more than the X number, in which case there's no need for an NCMP. Yes.
There was another observation in the book that led to the creation of the NCMP scheme, which was that the idea that PAP backbenchers perhaps pulled their punches in the House in order to avoid damaging the party. Do you think that there was some sort of a structural self-censorship and that limited their ability as PAP backbenchers to provide that effective check and balance? And could you
in one
also
of his
share
speeches,
how...
Mr. Lee Kuan Yew did mention this. I mentioned this in one of my books too, that we do not want to minimize the role of the backbenchers. They speak up. But as I said in my book, the PAP MPs sometimes may be inhibited in avoiding scoring an own goal, you know. So it is true the opposition MPs will not pull any punches, right? And I also described in the book how I was arrowed by Mr. Lee Kuan Yew to the sparring partner with Mr. Jeyaretnam, right? And I found that personally to be a great experience because it put me on my toes, right? I didn't know what new issue is going to raise and what supplementary questions. So if he had asked a question about some issue, sensitive issue or human rights issue, I had to do a lot of homework to be thoroughly sure I could anticipate all these questions. So I concluded in my book that that experience probably helped me a lot in answering questions in Parliament.
I want to shift gears to maybe go into some personal observations of the book. Reading the book, I was quite struck by the LKY that was painted there through the documents that were declassified, through the discussions that you've detailed. And I was surprised by how different, for example, the actual policy and law was compared to what Lee Kuan Yew had started with. So, for example, the elected presidency, where Lee Kuan Yew had actually started with vast powers
Very
for the
powerful,
president. Very powerful.
Powerful wicket keeper, yeah.
Ability to dissolve parliament, call for referendum, declare a state of emergency.
Yes.
And yet these proposals were vociferously challenged by his cabinet colleagues very methodically as well. So my question is, do you think that Lee Kuan Yew was more open to persuasion than the general public realizes?
in the speech at my book launch, I described two myths and misconception. One misconception is that Mr. Lee Kuan Yew is so powerful, so firm in his views that he brooks no dissent and contrary views. But what you have mentioned and what I've elaborated in my book shows that what Mr. Barker told me and the advice he gave me was spot on. Mr. Barker told me, look, Jaya, he can be headstrong. Mr. Lee Kuan Yew can be headstrong, but he's intellectually honest. And I think Barker was spot on, because Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, however strong an argument he had, if you had a point of view, he wanted you to put that point of view, right? And he would listen. But of course, you cannot waffle your way through, right? You better be sure you have a cogent argument. And you'll find in the book, even myself repeatedly putting the point to him about judicial review, right? What the quote you mentioned just now, yes, he had this powerful wicketkeeper, because in his mind, if there is a clash, an impasse between the elected government and the elected presidency, that no, you should not touch the reserves. The elected government says, look, I was elected and I'm entitled and have the power to touch the reserves. And the elected president says, I'm also elected, right? So there's a contestation of wills. So in Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's mind, to prevent an irresponsible spending of the reserves, the elected president must have all the wherewithals and the arsenal of powers. And so he had all those powers in mind. But we, the younger ministers, said that it will be difficult to defend that, and it may be difficult to persuade the people, right? So finally, you find in the book that I had to convey to Mr. Lee Kuan Yew the consensus of the younger ministers, and I wrote him a note to say that, in my view, the younger ministers can only accept an elected president with blocking powers, and he accepted it. There's one part of the book, Sulin, which embodies this. Mr. Lee Kuan Yew says at one stage, what is important is not that the solution I propose is accepted. Rather, what is important is, what is a solution that you, the younger team, younger guard, can work with? So he was also mindful that this is a proposal that will be actually operated and enforced by the new team.
I guess what was also surprising was how sharp-elbowed some of the comments were when these three institutions were debated. So, for example, when the initial proposals for the GRC system was put forth, Albert Mater called them demeaning. And of course, when LKY put forth the suggestions for the elected presidency, Ong Pan Boon called them undemocratic, very strong words. And it strikes me that these vociferous exchanges then enabled a clearer deliberation of the trade-offs that eventually does strengthen policy making. So my question is, what made such sharp exchanges possible? Do you ever worry about political correctness dampening debate in Parliament?
No, I don't think so. I don't know what happens in today's cabinet, but every prime minister has his own style, right? I worked under three prime ministers: Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Chok Tong, and Lee Hsien Loong. The styles may be different, but I would say this attitude of listening to contrary views was not just in Lee Kuan Yew's cabinet. Goh Chok Tong also encouraged it in his premiership, and so too Lee Hsien Loong. In fact, as I said in my speech, Goh Chok Tong introduced another layer of discussions and a very informal pre-cabinet discussions, where over lunch we would have a freewheeling discussions, including matters which might be discussed in cabinet. Right? So the styles may be different, but we should not think that it's just the vigor with which you express your view that your view is heard. I think more important is whether your views are sound, whether they are persuasive, whether they're cogent, right? I give you an example. At first, I was very worried about the width of the powers he had proposed. Very few checks. So I said to Mr. Lee, I wrote him several times that at least there should be a role for the judiciary to have a judicial review. He dismissed it initially. He says, well, this is a contestation of political wills. How can the judiciary? He misunderstood me. I was not talking about judicial review of the merits of the president's decision, but of the legality of the decision. Eventually, he came around. He said he agreed with my view. So I think it's not the trenchant or strongly worded manner of the view, but whether you have a point or not. If you have a point, he's willing to listen to it. He's willing to change his mind. So I was very grateful that Mr. Barker gave me that advice, because it encouraged me because if you're intellectually honest, you must be prepared to listen to contrary views.
What do you think it takes to hire such a great ensemble cast of cabinet ministers? I ask because your book also comes 8 months after the Albatross Files, which clearly demarcates the roles.
It comes after the
Albatross Files.
Oh, okay.
And it demarcates an era of strong leaders around LKY as well. And that theme comes through your book as well. What does it take to hire that strong cabinet?
I think every Prime Minister has a challenge to persuade people that he thinks have what the qualities you describe to come in and join the group on the journey, right? Take myself. I never thought I would be in politics, right? And that was furthest from my mind until Goh Chok Tong made the approach and said, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, asked him to form a team and would I join politics, right? No training, right? But they made an assessment, and so it changed the course of my life. So every Prime Minister has this challenge, how to induct people who he thinks will be a great asset to his team. Right? It's not easy because there are many factors that discourage people from getting into politics.
Another surprising observation that comes through in your book is how much involvement political office holders had in shaping policy making from the get-go and shepherding it through, which I think stands in contrast to the view that many people might have today about how you can just leave it to the civil servants. To what extent is the experience of that aspect in your book, representative of the kind of policy making in, as you say, also in Goh Chok Tong cabinet and the Lee Hsien Loong cabinet?
I would say it depends on what is a matter and what's a problem that you're addressing. Some problems, some issues and some concerns may require more political strategizing and thinking in long-term vision. There are some issues that you can ask the civil servants to staff papers and then put up recommendations. But on issues like should we have a minimum number of opposition MPs, should we have a minimum number of minority MPs to be assured in Parliament at all times? I'm not sure. These are both political and policy issues. And it requires the ministers, really, to take responsibility in strategizing these issues. I'm not sure we can just leave it to civil servant because they will need guidance as to how far you're going to go, right? It's a highly strategic and political issues.
So I have a question about due process. The first detailed memo. The first detailed memo on the elected presidency went to DEFCO, the Defence Council, whose members were ministers handling national security and defence issues. Why was a proposal about constitutional design going to that council?
I can easily answer that. We shouldn't conclude that we regard it as a highly national security issue, anything like that. Mr. Lee Kuan Yew had a cabinet, but this was a sensitive matter. He wanted only a small group. So he says, I want to discuss this in a small group. And I'm not sure that he suggested or I suggested, look, a small group is already available in the DEFCO. So why don't we just get the DEFCO ministers, right? Which are few, Prime Minister Keng Swee Rajaratnam, and the Minister of Finance, Keng Swee, the Finance Minister, and the Foreign Minister. And it included then some of the new guard, like Dhanabalan was second Foreign Minister, I believe, and Goh Chok Tong was there's one DPM and Tony Tan. So about 5 or 6. So I believe he said, yes, use that vehicle, but add on, Barker was not a member of the DEFCO. And of course, I was not a member of DEFCO, and I was invited, and I had to take notes, and I circulated the notes which are reproduced in the book. Right? So, no, I hasten to assure you, we did not treat it as a national security issue, but it was just a ready-made small group there already, say use it.
Okay. One last question about due process. There are a lot of top secret ancestral documents in this book. How does one go about declassifying these things? And did you have to make a compelling case?
No, I didn't have to make a compelling case. I mean, I left it to the National Archives to make the decision on declassification, right? Which they did, right? So it's not me making a compelling case. And both then Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong and Prime Minister Lawrence Wong did not restrict me on what I was going to write and what documents. And they agreed it was an interesting narrative to write. From 44 years or 45 years has passed, and it's worth getting the public to understand how these dynamics of discussions took place. And so I left it to the National Archives to sort out the declassification.
So last important point that came across in your book is the idea that there are no sacred cows, even though, of course, any amendments and any changes to these constitutional arrangements should be made with the utmost care. And in your book also, you actually say, from time to time, there must be a review of these major constitutional innovations and assess if the original, rational, and objective still holds.
Correct.
More recently, Senior Minister Lee Hsien Loong, at the launch of a book of 25 years of legal reform. That's right. He also made a similar point about how a defining feature of Singapore's approach to governance is that we've never treated law as a occasional one-off exercise. That reform is a continuous undertaking. So with that in mind, my question to you is, as one of the architects of these three institutions, are there any tweaks or suggestions that you would have today in refreshing them for today's Singapore?
If you ask me as of now, I do not have. If you ask me whether at some stage a review needs to be done, probably yes. Why? And this is not just about these three laws. My own philosophy, personal philosophy, as a legally trained person and as somebody who had been participating in the making of laws and the drafting of laws, I believe that in any society, the effectiveness of the whole body of legal system, the effectiveness of punishments, the effectiveness of individual laws depends to a large extent on the general agreement and acceptance of the people. I'm not saying that every law everybody must be happy with, right? But by and large, the entire fabric of the legal system, of the rule of law, and a sense of safety, security, and assuredness that your family and you are protected, people must feel that, yes, we agree that our legal system and our body of laws punish. You may gripe, you may complain about certain punishments, you may have your views on the death penalty, you may have views on other things. But taken as a whole, do you feel that you're safe in Singapore, that you're secure in Singapore? And over a period of time, values may change. To a large extent, laws must reflect the broad body of values of the population. If the values of the population over a period of time, succeeding generations change, that may also affect the degree of acquiescence or acceptance of particular laws.
I'm rounding off now, and I wanted to get your insight because the book does put across how heavy a responsibility you had in drafting these laws. You've also had very heavy responsibilities throughout your career in politics as Home Affairs Minister. You were also involved in the Hotel New World collapse. You were there when the CPF rules had to be changed. How do you do all this and also balance against your role as the Member of Parliament for Bedok? Because you've only got 24 hours a day. How did you juggle all that?
I cannot claim that I was in any way more extraordinary than any minister. Every minister has its challenges.
Were there inherent tensions between your demands as a cabinet minister versus your time as MP in Bedok?
Okay, let me answer the matter of the MP as Bedok. Every minister knows or should know that he has to look after the constituency. Absolutely important. Why? You're a minister because you're an MP, first and foremost. All our ministers, before they become ministers, must become an MP because the ministers come from the ranks of the MPs. So if you want to continue as a minister for a second term, you jolly well make sure you get elected as an MP, which means however busy you are, you cannot ignore the constituency. You have to look after the constituency. The people expect to see you, expect you to cater for their needs, the problems. And there are so many interest groups, right? The private housing, the public housing, HDB, the merchants, the shopkeepers, the food centres, the old, the young, and an MP ignores this at great peril. So I think every MP, every minister knows that he has to. Is it a challenge? Yes, of course it's a challenge. But it's not just a challenge to an office holder like me. There are also MPs who are busy CEOs or busy top lawyers, right? They also have the same challenge as you described.
But is it heavier because you're an anchor minister and do you need to be responsible for the GRC?
Anchor minister, it depends. That different anchor ministers have different styles. As an anchor minister, I periodically met with my colleagues to find out how things are going on in their wards. And I rotated. I would have Meet the People session in my ward, and subsequent weeks I would used to take over the Meet the People session, and we used to rotate. There are different styles and different methods different ministers use. But a point I want to make is, yes, you have your ministerial position, but you should not get the ministerial position get into your head and ignore the constituency. It's super important to make sure that the constituency is well looked after. It's a challenge, I think, for some ministerial portfolios. Foreign Affairs, Minister of Trade and Industry travel a lot. So I know that Vivian has a challenge. I had a challenge as Foreign Minister because the nature of today's diplomacy requires you to travel. ASEAN, numerous meetings, non-ASEAN meetings, conferences, United Nations, even bilateral diplomacy, you have to go and shake hands and talk to your counterpart, right? So what that means is inevitably you miss attending Meet the People session and so on. But I was very gratified that the residents understood, and we made sure that the other MPs covered you, and even if I was away, the Meet the People session continued with one of the other MPs sitting there, and the letters were written, right? So that it's a particular challenge for some ministers who have to travel a lot.
Speaking of covering duties, you're also a dad of 3. How did you juggle all this, your political life, your responsibilities, as well as at home?
That I think is quite a challenge because you do have to be disciplined to find some time for your family. When I became an MP, my children were not yet teenagers, and I think it was super important to have a spouse that understands and takes on the extra burden, because you do come back quite late every day and so on. But it's not just for me. I think every MP has that challenge. Office holders may have a little bit more. But I was fortunate that my late wife was understanding. And so everybody has coped. I think every politician in the world has that challenge.
But did you feel like you had to make a big sacrifice because of that? Did you make sacrifices? Your personal sacrifices?
I wouldn't say it's a great sacrifice. You have less time for your family, right? I think in today's context, politicians have greater challenges than I had. Social media now zooms in on every aspect of your life. Privacy is a treasured thing, and it's increasingly difficult to shelter your family from the penetrating eyes of the social media.
Well, thanks, Prof. Jaya. Did you have any parting shots for our listeners?
My only wish and hope is that, as I tried to emphasize in the course of talking to you, is what is important is not the modalities that we came out to deal with the concern or the issue, like the GRC for minorities representation. So I would always like to frame people's thinking as, do you agree that there is this concern, right? That it's good always to have racially representative parliament. If you agree, then we can talk about any kinds of solutions. We had this solution with GRC, but maybe you can come up with a better solution, right?
Thank you so much for your candid views today, Professor Jayakumar. That was Professor S Jayakumar. His book, 3 Unique Laws, is now out. You can get them in most major bookstores. I'm Lin Su Ling, opinion editor at the Straits Times, and thank you for listening to us.
Thank you very much.